Here's a sentence that should not make sense in 2026. Spirit Airlines, the carrier that made flying cheaper than a bus ticket, filed for bankruptcy while Americans were flying more than at any point in history. More passengers should mean more money, but the moment you start pulling on that thread, the story falls apart completely. Spirit didn't fail because people stopped flying. It failed because the system it was built on quietly broke down around it, and nobody saw it coming until it was too late. To understand how that happened, you need to go back to how low-cost airlines were supposed to work in the first place. The idea was simple. Remove everything passengers didn't absolutely need. No free meals, no assigned seats, no extra legroom. Charge the lowest possible base fare, then make money on every bag, every upgrade, key to every small add-on. Fill every single seat on every single flight. Repeat that thousands of times a day, and the money adds up fast. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Through the 2010s, airlines like Spirit, Frontier, and their cousins around the world were growing faster than almost anyone in the industry. Millions of people who had never been able to afford a plane ticket were suddenly flying. College students, young families, people visiting relatives across the country for the first time. The model wasn't just profitable, it genuinely changed who got to fly. That was the world. Efficient, predictable, ruthlessly optimized. Then three things broke at exactly the same time. And here is the most important thing to understand before we go any further. The ultra-low-cost model only works when everything goes according to plan. There is no backup. There is no cushion. When the system gets hit, there is nothing to absorb the blow. In the 2020s, it got hit 3 times. On paper, some of the numbers are genuinely impressive. At its peak, Spirit was one of the fastest-growing airlines in the entire United States. It was flying routes that bigger carriers like Delta and United had ignored for years. Smaller cities, underserved airports, passengers nobody else was bothering to compete for. And the way Spirit made money was actually creative. Bag fees, seat selection charges, priority boarding. Spirit didn't invent those ideas by accident. It built an entirely new way of selling airline tickets, where the base fare was just the starting point. Every major airline in America now uses that same playbook. Spirit wrote it. But the whole system rested on 3 things staying stable at the same time. Low fuel costs, available aircraft, and passengers with no cheaper option. All 3 collapsed at once. The first shock was COVID. Overnight, Spirit's entire business model stopped working. Legacy carriers had cargo operations, government contracts, and international routes to lean on. Spirit had none of that. It had seats, and suddenly nobody was sitting in them. The second shock came from inside the fleet. Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan engines, the engines powering Spirit's entire Airbus A320neo fleet, were recalled for urgent inspections. Spirit was forced to ground dozens of aircraft, but it still had to pay the monthly lease on every single one of them, flying or not. The third shock was the one that closed the door completely. The DOJ blocked Spirit's planned merger with JetBlue in January 2024, leaving Spirit with no buyer and no way out. In 2019, Spirit had $1.3 billion in liquidity. By November 2024, it was filing for bankruptcy. 5 years, 3 shocks, 0 cushion. Most of the coverage you saw framed Spirit's collapse as a management problem. Bad branding, poor customer service, wrong strategy, and it's easy to see why that story spread. It's simple, and it gives someone to blame. But here is what actually happened. When you hear that Spirit made bad decisions, what you are really hearing is this. An airline with no financial buffer, a grounded fleet, a blocked merger, and rising interest rates on its debt made the only moves it had access to. These were not strategic choices. They were survival calculations. Think about what that position actually looks like. Paying full monthly lease costs on planes you are legally not allowed to fly, while cutting costs on the planes you can. That equation has no solution. This is not a story about a bad airline. It is a story about what happens when an ultra-lean system runs into a world that stopped behaving predictably. The ultra-low-cost model works like a machine with very tight tolerances. Fuel prices, aircraft availability, labor costs, and passenger demand. Every variable has to stay inside a narrow range. The moment one of them moves too far, the whole system strains. When several move at once, it breaks. Grounding more than 40 aircraft didn't just shrink Spirit's operation. It wiped out over $100 million in quarterly revenue, while every fixed cost stayed exactly where it was. And because post-COVID pilot shortages were still hitting the industry hard, Spirit couldn't even crew the planes it had left at full efficiency. An operational problem that was really a cost problem in disguise. Spirit's own CEO admitted in company filings that the engine crisis alone cost the airline hundreds of millions of dollars. Their entire business model had no room for a number that size. The fees passengers hated weren't greed. They were the entire financial architecture holding the airline together. Spirit was not alone. In the same 24-month window that Spirit was unraveling, Flyer collapsed in Norway, Bonza shut down in Australia, and Go First filed for bankruptcy in India. Different countries, different routes, different management teams, same result. That pattern is telling you something important. This is not about any one airline making the wrong calls. The ultra-low-cost model itself was built for a world that no longer exists. A world of stable fuel prices, low interest rates, cheap aircraft leases, and smooth global supply chains. That world is gone. The engine supply crisis, rising lease rates, and the post-COVID labor market are not temporary problems waiting to be fixed. They are permanent changes to the environment every low-cost carrier now has to operate in. This isn't about one airline. It's about what happens when the global system that made ultra-cheap flying possible is forced to absorb shocks it was never designed to handle. When it does, the market doesn't just correct, it culls. Here is the part that stings the most. What the airline Spirit was supposed to disrupt, Delta, United, American, came out of the exact same turbulent period stronger than they went in. Same shocks, completely different outcome. The reason is diversification. Legacy carriers had cargo operations bringing in revenue when passengers disappeared. They had corporate travel contracts, international routes, and loyalty programs generating billions even during the worst months. When the shocks hit, those revenue streams absorbed the blow. Spirit had none of them. But here's the twist. While Spirit was struggling to survive, Delta, United, and American were quietly copying everything Spirit had built. Basic economy fares, bag fees, seat selection charges. They took Spirit's innovations, attached them to a much stronger financial structure, and kept the profits. Once the student dismantled the teacher's model, the teacher copied the student's ideas. Then the teacher outlasted the student entirely. Spirit democratized flying and then got eliminated by the airlines that learned from it. Spirit's exit didn't just remove an airline. It removed a price ceiling that was keeping every other carrier honest. Millions of travelers who depended on ultra-cheap fares to visit family, travel for work, or fly for the first time are now looking at a less competitive market. That has a real cost, and real people are feeling it. Frontier is trying to fill the gap. But Frontier is working with the same structural constraints that brought Spirit down. The same engine problems, the same labor market, the same rising lease rates. Meanwhile, Ryanair in Europe keeps growing. Lower labor costs, not a single aircraft type across the entire fleet, in a regulatory environment that never blocked its expansion the way the DOJ blocked Spirit's, which raises the question that nobody in the American aviation industry wants to answer directly. Can the ultra-low-cost model actually survive in the United States? Or did Spirit's collapse reveal that the U.S. market, with its labor costs, aging infrastructure, and supply chain fragility, simply cannot sustain it at scale? So did Spirit fail? Not in the way the headlines suggested. Spirit didn't fail because it had bad leadership or an ugly brand or seats that didn't recline. Spirit failed because the conditions that made Spirit possible stopped existing, and Spirit had no architecture to survive their absence. Legacy carriers didn't outcompete Spirit. They outlasted a system collapse that Spirit had no tools to weather. That is a very different thing. It means nobody won anything here. Something larger simply broke, and Spirit was the least equipped to survive the breaking. The real question isn't whether Spirit will come back. It's whether the world that made Spirit possible is ever coming back. And right now, the evidence says no. If you want to understand why the airline currently building the world's cheapest long-haul flights is making the exact same structural mistakes Spirit made, that story is already in motion, and it does not end the way their marketing suggests.